Hello, I'm Peter Asimus, Director of Strategic Marketing here at AutoGrid, and this is our vodcast series on the grid edge. Today, we have Sruthi Davuluri, also from AutoGrid, and we're going to be talking about quite a few items. We're going to talk about some of the partnerships we're having, some of the policies that impact VPPs. But to begin with, you and I, Sruthi, started about the same time with AutoGrid about a year ago. I came from the analyst community with Navigant Guidehouse. So why don't you talk a little bit about where you came from and why you came to AutoGrid and why you're interested in VPPs?
Sure. Thanks for asking, Peter. So, someone was to ask me when I got derpilled or when I got really interested in DERs. My DER journey started actually with in Santiago in Chile when I was doing a project looking at a community of residential houses. If they got rooftop solar and batteries, how could we design some sort of tariff or community energy sharing program for them to, use those assets for resiliency and in an economically efficient way. And so that's when I got really interested. Back then, about 5 years ago, we used to call that urban microgrids. And it's definitely, taken a long journey to where we see VPPs today. But I think that question has been really on my mind for a while. What is the economically efficient way to, how will we change our business models as we bring more DERs onto the distribution grid, and how will that impact our relationship with end customers, with utilities, to really manage those assets well. And so, when I was, in my master's thesis in grad school, I wanted to explore that question further, to explore different alternatives of both a technical and an economically efficient solution for bringing all these DERs online. And then I joined an economic consulting firm named Energy and Environmental Economics, E3.
E3, yeah.
Right. And so that was a really great opportunity to look at a wide variety of questions. When will a cold climate become a winter peaking system when they electrify all of their buildings, for example? Or how do we design an EV charging tariff that will take advantage of all of the solar in Hawaii, for another example? And I did a lot of revenue forecasting. It was a really great way to look at a number of economic issues across the power system as we try to decarbonize our grid. And at the time, more VPP software companies, they were coming out and really broadcasting this idea of taking demand flexibility and monetizing it in different ways. So I did sort of a competitive analysis looking at all of the players in the space and understanding, who does what well, and how do they differentiating themselves. And so that's when I started to speak with folks. Actually, I spoke with Amit first at AutoGrid to understand, where do they fit in the space and how are they different from some of the other players. And right. I was really interested in, I was really excited about, I think some companies, they start with an idea, they start with a deck, and then they shift to focusing on their product. Whereas I was really impressed by the way everyone at AutoGrid, they started with the software, they started with the algorithms, the machine learning based predictive controls algorithms and software that our whole platform is based off of, and then, built the business model around that. I was very impressed by the, kind of scalability of the platform and just the technology and the product. And so that's why I decided to join a year ago.
Yeah, well, in some ways we have similar paths because I was, of course, forecasting the future of VPPs. And like I say, someone pointed out, I guess I'm in Wikipedia. They quoted me from like a report way back in 2012. And actually I was ranking vendors, and I remember I'd ranked another vendor higher than AutoGrid in a report. And I think I engaged with Amit, and it was really scalability was the thing that struck me as I learned about some of the other companies and the way, there's so many different players in the VPP market. Some start more with storage and then they've kind of branched out. But, AutoGrid always started sort of with software and also thinking about sort of interoperability, which we'll talk about here in this podcast. But, before we go forward, we're just always saying VPP. So first of all, that stands for virtual power plant. And there is no government definition, unlike microgrids, which is the other area that I actually started with, and then I still do stuff with microgrids. There's actually a DOE definition of a
Mhm.
microgrid. But what is a VPP or virtual power plant, and how does software make that happen?
Mhm. Yeah, great question. But I mean, both you and I live in the Bay Area, so I like to give this answer in relation to make it really tangible to how you could relate to a VPP. So let's say,
Hmm.
for example, we look at all of Silicon Valley or the San Jose area, right, and which has a lot more adoption of electric vehicles, rooftop solar, and behind the meter batteries. Right now, if those assets are only being dispatched or managed at the individual level, they may not be able to, contribute to their fullest potential. However, if
Right.
we aggregate all of the distributed energy resources in a neighborhood, in a community, then we can actually have enough flexible capacity to use in place of a peaker plant. So, for example, you remember last Labor Day when there was a huge heat wave and
Right.
Governor Newsom was texting everybody, please turn off your electricity. I feel like receiving text messages or seeing, signs on the 101 is a little, it's like so 2001, right? I feel like we've come past that a lot.
Uh-huh.
And we've come past that in a lot of ways. And so uh, I think instead, aggregating these DERs that are already deployed and being able to dispatch them in place of a peaker plant is really, the future of where I see our grid shifting towards.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other way, yeah, most people, like I finally, although it's not, I don't have the contract in hand, I'm going to install a solar battery system. So, of course, I'm doing that mainly for my own economic interest and also just sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that with a VPP, I can also contribute to the larger grid. So, you can kind of have it both ways. That's the beauty of this. It almost sounds too good to be true when you describe it to some people. They're going, really? Can that really happen? But, that's the idea. And it's not just supply, it's also demand. And in fact, a lot of VPPs, and I think with AutoGrid, really started more with demand response. That's kind of where it started more in the US. In Europe, they kind of started more with renewables. And now it's all, the whole idea is multi-asset, multi-market VPPs, where it doesn't matter really if it's supply, demand, load, as
Mm-hmm.
long as you can sense it, aggregate it. That's the beauty of the VPP. And then you're providing value upstream whenever the grid needs it, and ideally like the exact amount of energy, at the exact time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's kind of the goal. So you know AutoGrid is a software company, so that's that's what enables a VPP. Obviously, I think one phrase I've been using, and I know that some other folks like it. The VPP becomes the glue that holds the future grid together. But really to develop these VPPs, we need to have a stake. It can't just be one company. It can't just be, one vendor in this huge grid and, all these options out there. So we need a sort of a stakeholder ecosystem. You recently came back from RMI, used to be called the Rocky Mountain Institute. Now it's, I guess, just referred to as RMI, and there's a VP3 initiative. So why don't you tell us what's that all about and why is that
Mm-hmm.
important?
Thanks. Actually, before I answer that question, I just wanted to comment in response to
Sure.
something you said.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way of capturing how we're shifting our paradigm of how utilities are planning. And I heard a quote actually at the RMI workshop about how utilities in the past were planning, they were forecasting future load and planning generation to meet that load. Whereas in
Hmm.
the future, it'll be somewhat the opposite, right? We're actually forecasting generation, which is coming from all of these renewables, somewhat intermittent resources, and
Hmm.
then planning our load accordingly. And I think that when I heard that phrasing, I think it really, captures the issue and why we need a platform like VPPs to help manage and forecast load, forecast generation from renewables, and how do we shift that demand accordingly.
Sure.
So, yeah, no, thanks for asking. Recently got back from an RMI workshop for it was the RMI Virtual Power Plant Partnership, so VP3, and
Hmm.
it was a really great opportunity to speak with so many people that I met during the pandemic virtually, either
Hmm.
from my interviewing process or in collaboration on different opportunities. It was a wonderful mix of people in the VPP space, including VPP providers, some OEM partners of ours, of AutoGrid's partners, and even a couple AutoGrid customers as well. And so it was great to have everyone in the same room and discussing what are some of the issues with, accelerating the deployment of VPPs, and how can we all come together with a collective voice to help, remove some of these barriers and hurdles that we're seeing in the market today, both from a regulatory perspective and also from a data communications and interoperability, right? So ideally, we would all of our devices would be able to communicate, in an easy way. There's no need to, and so we're definitely at AutoGrid. We're all about open standards, and really appreciate, others who are thinking similarly.
Is that so? Is that sort of the one of the primary focuses of the RMI initiative? Is this idea of interoperability, open standards? Of course, our colleague Vish Ganti just recently published a blog about being on the board of the Sunspec Alliance, which is also kind of dealing with similar issues. And I know that I actually was involved recently with a report by the Linux Foundation talking about open source microgrids and looking how the IT segment kind of moved a little bit closer to that to deal with that, and can the electricity market. So how important are these open standards? Is that kind of a primary focus of the RMI initiative?
De- Definitely, I think that is one key goal that RMI seeks to achieve with the VP3 workshop and kind of community that they've built. I
Hmm.
think right now it's a really interesting time for EVs and EVSEs. I'm sure Vish mentioned that as well. As some of these traditional auto companies are shifting to more electric vehicles, I think it's a really great opportunity to collaborate and speak with them in terms of how do they want to be a part of this transition, right? What part do they want to play in the VPP world? And so for me, that was a big lesson learned I had from speaking with some of these auto OEMs and just other OEM partners to hear their perspective. There were two things I really key lessons learned for me. One being, we need to stop thinking about these EVs as megawatts, right? These are actually drivers who are customers who need to get to work in the morning, and so I
Right.
think respecting their privacy and understanding their customer choice and really trying to maintain customer comfort is very very important when we're thinking about virtual power plants. And so that was one, especially the privacy piece, right? When we talk
Right.
about data telematics, I think it's a really exciting from an EV management perspective or a charging perspective, but we also want to respect boundaries in terms of knowing where the EVs are at all times of the day. You could really learn a lot about a customer
Right.
from analyzing their analytics data. The second lesson learned for me was that these EV, the reason why some of these EV or car companies were attending, right? Once they have more EVs on the road, once we have more electrified fleets and electrified vehicles on the road, we really need to make sure that we maintain reliability for those customers, right? We need to make sure that we keep the lights on. In the last year, right, or last few years, we've seen there's so many examples of longer outages in ERCOT with Winter Storm Uri, or the winter storm around Christmas Eve in PJM territory, or
Right.
countless power outages we've seen in California. And how are we going to convince more people to shift to EVs if we can't maintain charging infrastructure, make sure that they can charge up their vehicles? And so VPPs can play a large role in maintaining that reliability for the grid. And so that was a really interesting kind of thought experiment for me, right? Is how can VPPs play a role not only in using these EVs efficiently, but also making sure that they can charge when they need to.
Right. And that comes back also to microgrids, which are actually even, I know that Schneider Electric, which acquired AutoGrid, has done a few projects on the East Coast, kind of touching that topic of, if the grid is so unreliable and we're going to electrify transportation, you can imagine that some people might be afraid, like, well, if the grid goes down, will I be able to use my EV? Or critical facilities who might be first responders or
Mm-hmm.
something. So I think this is where it's interesting where some of the work that Schneider has done dovetails with AutoGrid. And of course, I've been working on a white paper which is going to come out soon that sort of talks about how AutoGrid's technology can kind of mesh with Schneider Electric's technology, bridging kind of microgrids and VPPs. But I believe one thing also the RMI initiative is looking at, I think, is policy. I think one thing about VPPs is, you know, yes, you might have the technology, but if there's no market for you to sell some of these services in, or if the market is not designed well, I guess you could say, then we're not going to be able to take full advantage of those DERs. I think the one most people talk about is FERC Order 2222, which, I think basically just says, I think it's aggregations as small as 100 kilowatts can actually sell into wholesale markets, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Something that small actually going all the way up the wholesale market. But I don't know if you want to talk about FERC Order 222 or any other sort of policy initiatives out there. Maybe some of them not as obvious about their impact on VPPs, but isn't that part of also the RMI initiative, is looking at policy?
Mm-hmm. That was definitely a key topic that we spoke about, and it was that was another area where it was really helpful to have similar VPP players in the same room discussing some of their key target states that where they were following regulatory proceedings, where they're kind of white space states that we should pivot our attention to moving forward, and how can we together submit comments. And so you bring up a good I remember it was 2020 when FERC Order 2222 came out, and I think a lot of us in the industry were very excited about the potential for that regulation to shift how behind the meter assets will make money and participate. I don't think we've seen as much progress as maybe we would have liked to.
I wasn't going to say that, but you can say that. But yeah.
I was actually just looking. I think both MISO and ISO New England, there have been some delays in them completing their compliance filings for 2222, and I think we need something in the meantime. I wouldn't put my money in waiting for 2222 because, for example, even in California where they have completed the compliance filings, in order for behind the meter batteries, for example, to get to actually get online, there's some issues with baselining for behind the meter batteries. For example, you could do a demand response baseline, but that doesn't really make sense for a behind the meter battery. And then there are other opportunities. For example, I think it's called a meter generating output, where you're only getting compensated for how much is the battery exporting itself, right? Rather than according to a baseline. But in order to get compensated according to the meter generating output, you need a certain approval process, which adds a lot of delays, or you could get denied. And so, just complying with 2222 is one thing, but then also removing the friction for behind the meter batteries to come online to participate in different market services. I think that's the next step that we really need to pay attention to. My key policy question for VPPs is, how do VPPs get compensated? How do DERs get compensated moving forward? And how can we ensure a long-term kind of longevity of these compensation mechanisms moving forward? Because if I'm an OEM and I'm trying to put a revenue forecast together for how much these vehicle to grid school buses will make, for example, or behind the meter batteries, and a lot of these policies are still in pilot phase. They may have a deadline in which they no longer exist, or the export tariffs are constantly changing. It's really difficult to forecast a longer term revenue forecast, revenue stream moving forward. So I think just enabling some sort of certainty with our DER compensation is something I feel very strongly about.
Yeah, well, I think that's, I know that our CEO, Ruben, recently wrote a blog or an article that was just published about the obstacles to VPPs, because I think, it sounds exciting and sometimes sounds too good to be true to some people, but it's the compensation part that's still kind of, like you mentioned, EVs, and we just did a webinar in EVs. There's this bill in California that's passed that would make EVs bidirectional, but the challenge right now is there is a program to compensate EVs, but it's a limited pilot program. If you really want to tap EVs as a grid resource. I mean, there's the other issues you mentioned, mobility, and people are going to want to drive their car when they need to, and that's why I think we've been thinking more about fleets as kind of like the good place to start, like
Mm-hmm.
buses. I know
Mm-hmm.
we have a partnership with Zoom, and the idea a bus actually has a schedule, so when that bus is driving, when that bus is parked, it's got a big, big battery. So that's kind of where it starts. But yeah, the compensation is really critical for VPPs, and we mentioned FERC Order 222 was supposed to kind of create a little more of a harmonization, because one
Mm-hmm.
thing about the U.S. market is it's very balkanized. I mean, Texas, of course, doesn't even um, comply with FERC order. It's like the Texans always want to be independent, but each region has its quirks, and then there's areas where there is no ISO
Mm-hmm.
RTO at all, like the Rocky Mountain states and the Deep South. So that's a pretty long-winded question there, but I was going to say, um, I think compensation is key, but what I always like to say to folks is generally the policy is moving in a more positive direction. I mean, do you feel that too? Or, I mean, there's the battles that are still frustrating. And I know in California, I hear a lot of people also complaining, like people think hold up California is this, oh, they're figuring it all out in California. Well, we have done a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of challenges. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what is your view? Are you optimistic about the way policy is going, or maybe you want to give a few examples of some sort of maybe surprising? I know that recently we were talking about some ideas about fixed
Mm-hmm.
residential rates. You want to talk about any of those sort of examples? Your views on
Sure,
that?
sure, sure. Yeah. Before I do, I really appreciate you speaking about compensation and how these DERs getting compensated, and two areas I think policy could, create a really big impact. Uh, Oftentimes in these export rates, we're just, taking these, we're just taking these, the import rate, and maybe with NEM two, for example, right? We just took the import rate and then shaved off a few cents, and then that was the export rate. And I think we need to take a step back. I really like the New York meter calculator, and how there's sort of a long term. You can download it. It's pretty easy to play around with, and there's some sort of long term. It's locked in for a few years, and they really break down every component that the DER would be avoiding, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
California obviously has a avoided cost calculator as well. And one component I think we need to speak about more, and that we need more kind of insight and um, clarity on, would be the transmission and distribution deferral costs. So, for
Okay.
example, I think when we have more EVs on the road, right, well, the distribution network will experience more congestion in certain kind of targeted areas, right? And so
Right.
that's one area where AutoGrid Flex and virtual power plants can play a really key role in terms of targeted dispatch, to defer distribution upgrades, which could
Right.
help save the utility money. And I'm not saying, defer it forever, but at least could defer it for a few years. And we call it non-wires alternatives, right?
Yep.
But
Yep.
there are no really good examples of non-wires alternatives being successful in the last few years. And I think actually getting a better dollar amount for how much money could VPPs avoid in terms of T&D investment would be really, really helpful. For example, there's a lot of information asymmetry, I would say, between how much money is the utility avoiding because of DERs, because of VPPs, right? And so I think
Right.
moving forward, it would be great to quantify that avoided cost in a more, precise way. Uh,
Sure. Yeah, what you were talking about. So we've used the term VPP. I guess the other thing we should point out with AutoGrid is we have a platform, but it can be used for demand response, VPPs, and then the other DERMS, the other buzzword, distributed energy resource management system. So I think when I think about more targeted relief, that's what I think of about DERMS. But there's no uniform definition. I know some people put DERMS at the very top and then below that VPP and other things. I don't know if you think about it that way or not. And I guess it doesn't really matter in some ways what you call it, But do you have a view on that?
right. I think sometimes it makes sense to, if if regions want to start from ground zero and maybe start with demand response and then shift to, once you get more flexible load, you get more flexible devices like with,
Right.
batteries and EVs, then you could shift to more DERMS, for example, right? And
Hmm.
then I see once you have more DERs deployed and you actually have enough capacity to play around with, comparable to a peaker,
Hmm.
or even if it's like 5-6 megawatts, I think that's still helpful for meeting resource adequacy needs, or for those extreme weather events. And so that's when I see, a virtual power plant really playing a big role. And so that's how I phrase it to, some of our customers is we can AutoGrid can help work with you, can work with them to start with something simple like a bring your own thermostat program, and then scale up with them as their customers adopt more DERs and bring them online.
Right. Well, that's also the beauty of DER solutions like VPPs or even microgrids is you don't have to do it all at once. It's incremental, and as people keep adding resources, and of course that's spotty all around the US and around the world, where there's certain areas where there's more of a type of resource, a certain area which might, because of utility incentives or the weather even, is going to impact what people install or what they adopt. So, but one thing I just realized I wanted to get to earlier, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I believe, we were talking about policy. Tell us, I think you're going to change your position title with the company soon. So aren't you, I think, well, are you industry solutions to, I forgot, I don't even know what your future title is going to be, but isn't it more on policy itself?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. Yeah, I know. Great question. It's still, I don't think it's been officially announced, but looking to be the new head of policy and market development at
Mhm.
AutoGrid. And so I'm really excited to not only focus on these policy questions, to collaborate with some of our partners or peers in the space, but
Mhm.
also, I really enjoy doing more revenue forecasting or identifying, for example, if you wanted to deploy a electric school bus fleet, where is the best, market to target next, right? And those types of questions are really exciting, especially in a rapidly evolving space.
Sure. Well, no, I think, oh, were you going to say something else?
No, no, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you and I both were talking for a little while saying like, does AutoGrid have a policy person? It's just kind of because and obviously AutoGrid now is we're hiring lots of people. I think the Schneider acquisition, and it's pretty exciting. We're going to be announcing how our products fit together. But I do think it just shows, well, the growth of AutoGrid and the need for us to pay more attention to policy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the US, of course, that's as I said earlier, VPPs are so dependent on regulatory structures. And, if it's a municipal utility versus an investor owned utility versus a co op versus a CCA, a community choice aggregation, all those structures will impact how they can use DERs and whether like a VPP is the focus or are they more focused on resiliency? Is it more of a microgrid
Mm-hmm.
type scenario? So I think policy, is important for the future. But as folks may have gathered listening to us, there is a lot of uncertainty out there, and sometimes that can be kind of scary, I guess, to utilities, probably smaller utilities who might not have all the resources, or very large utilities who might have such a large service territory for them to just try to figure out, well, where do I begin with a VPP? So one thing you and I actually collaborated on was a white paper about this new business model, turnkey VPPs. So I guess the message we're trying to say is if it seems confusing, doesn't mean you don't have to do anything. In fact, it's probably a mistake to not do anything, really start anticipating. But AutoGrid does have now this turnkey VPP. So why don't you tell us a little bit, what does that mean? What is a turnkey VPP?
Great question, Peter. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one thing I've really benefited from working in the industry solutions the last year or so was getting to speak with and work with and learn from utilities and how they're thinking about this transition. How can they play a role, right? And so being able to actually sign a contract and get a certain amount of megawatts comparable to how you would with a more traditional, power plant or a traditional gas generator, for example, is kind of the goal. Is the what we're aiming to do here is making it as simple and kind of comparable to what the utilities are used to in terms of acquiring supply for their service territory, And yeah, I think one thing I've learned is, like you said, every utility, every LSE, every region has their own kind of questions and requirements and constraints that, there is no one size fits all. And I think that
Right.
makes the space even more exciting. I think you can learn a lot of lessons from what has worked well, what has not worked well in California, and take those lessons elsewhere.
Sure. Well, yeah, you kind of summed up. So the turnkey VPP is this idea that AutoGrid does all the hard work, basically, is what it's saying, is that, yeah, we will help sign up all the asset owners. We'll also do the end where there's the settlements. Of course, that's what some people might wonder. Well, then how do I get paid? Who gets paid, who does the paying, and all that stuff. So the idea of the turnkey VPP is sort of, while all these markets are in transition and each region might have its own quirks. And like I said, we've been talking mainly about the US, but this is a global opportunity. In some ways, some people might say Europe is the most advanced with sort of more the trading aspect of VPPs, because they have an EU, they've kind of got all these countries kind of in maybe a more tightly knit market. But we've done a lot of stuff in Australia, India, Japan, I've
Mm-hmm.
heard people talk about. So the turnkey VPP is really, I think we put it out there during this time of transition. I don't think this transition will maybe ever end. It's always going to be evolving, but it does make it easier. If you want 30 megawatts, you could say you want carbon free 30 megawatts. I guess AutoGrid then would say, okay, look in your service territory, what's available. I mean, the other thing we've kind of hinted at about VPPs, the beauty of them is that all these assets are out there. They've already been paid for, generally
Mm-hmm.
speaking, whether it's a utility asset or owned by a third party, or a resident, or a
Mm-hmm.
consumer. So the beauty of the VPP is you're just getting more value out of those assets that have already
Mm-hmm.
been paid
Exactly.
for. So,
Exactly. And that's where, coming back to our earlier discussion on compensation, right? If a utility or if, if an ISO or whoever has the willingness to pay for a peaker plant, right, at a
right,
certain rate, then how can we, take that parallel and also compensate VPPs at a, more comparable value, right? And I think that's something at AutoGrid we feel very strongly about is, if we're providing the same reliability and same service that a peaker plant is doing in a low carbon, cheaper, more efficient way, then
right.
how can we get compensated in a similar manner?
Yeah, well, it sounds logical and fair, but that doesn't always win
We'll
out.
see.
Well, hopefully it wins out in the end. And yeah, no, the fossil, we've been emphasizing that. And also, but one topic we didn't bring up here and we should mention before we end is the equity issue. So that's one thing
Mm-hmm.
about that I know that you're passionate about, and others, is that, a lot of these new technologies, in fact, I was just talking to other folks at a local festival, and it's true when you talk to the average citizen, they're still like skeptical in some ways. Well, how is that going to work? EVs? I can't afford an EV yet, and they bring up so those issues. But the nice thing about VPPs is even if you don't own an EV yourself, you could benefit from those other people who own an
Mm-hmm.
EV if they're wrapped into a virtual power plant, and that is displacing the need to run that fossil peaker plant, which is actually typically located in a low income sort of area. So, before we wrap up, did you want to talk anything about equity and how that shapes some of your views on all of
Mm-hmm.
this stuff?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I had worked with a community solar company that actually had a target for bringing more LMI customers online, and so definitely equity is a very important question in the energy transition. I think we can't allow early adopters of rooftop solar and DERs to be the only one benefiting from this
Right,
transition, right? And so, and
right,
then also, there's a really important question to ask around half people in San Francisco are renting, right? How can they, if they can't electrify their home or adopt DERs themselves, how can they still play a role? And so, that I'm actually working on something, an exciting project this summer, where hopefully I can announce more publicly soon on how to bring in more, just more customer segments into the VPP landscape, and how can we involve more communities. Like we said, most of these peaker plants are typically near LMI communities, and so by avoiding the use of peaker plants, definitely a lot of air quality benefits, and hoping to see more of those over time. Uh,
Sure.
Actually, you earlier you asked me about the new PG&E, or sorry, the new California regulation around
Right.
income-based fixed charges. And so I think we were kind of going back and forth. I think there have been very polar opposite opinions in the media I've seen so far.
Hmm.
And you know, one area I feel very strongly about is that while transitioning to more rooftop solar and transitioning to more renewables is great, I think we need to do so in a more equitable way, right? And so I think one area, as we roll out more EV tariffs and as we roll out more dynamic rates, and there are all these pilot tariffs being discussed in California, we
Hmm.
want to make sure that we're not leaving behind or hurting LMI or lower to middle income customers in their with their utility bills and in their pockets. And so I think introducing a more progressive fixed costs so that we're not cross subsidizing too much is actually one way in which we can help LMI customers. Yeah, help them moving forward and to make sure that we're not shifting too many costs in the future. Does that make sense, or what do you think?
Yes. No, that makes sense. I think part of the NEM, which net metering debate, was there was just this recent deadline, and actually, ironically enough, I guess supposedly my system did squeeze under the old regime, which is more lucrative. But in some ways, I think from the AutoGrid perspective or folks in this industry,
Mm-hmm.
solar doesn't need the same subsidy it used to have. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
at some point programs have run their course, I guess you could say, or they
I,
achieved, a certain goal. And so I
mm-hmm.
know what some people believe now, that really to get the most value out of your solar system, you're going to want to pair it with a battery. But if you think about
Mm-hmm.
that, that's just going to make the grid more resilient, and that's going to make even more available assets for VPPs. Already solar bundled with batteries at this site is
Mm-hmm.
just going to make that, I guess, a more attractive resource from a VPP perspective. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, there's obviously, it's always hard to give up any subsidy. As
Right.
soon as
Actually,
people get a
right.
subsidy, they want to hang on to it. So yeah, go
Definitely.
ahead.
Actually, no, in response to that, I recently read, this was news to me. I was reading Leah Stokes, her book, Short Circuiting Policy, over the weekend. And she said, yeah, by 2011, almost 80% of states uh, passed an RPS policy, and then 44 states passed NEM. And I didn't realize that NEM was so, kind of rolled out almost all across the U.S. in early 2010s. That was really surprising to me. I thought it was mostly just the blue states or more of the renewable states. But the
Right.
reason why utilities didn't have a problem with it back then was because they didn't think that there would be enough rooftop solar to actually matter, right?
Right.
So it's
Right.
kind of an interesting example of utilities not fighting it at first because they didn't think it would hurt you know
Right.
their bottom line. But then once the behind the meter solar or rooftop solar industry kind of roll that in with all the ICT incentives and roll that in with all of the other state solar incentives, they actually created a really interesting business model. So I mean, I think we should learn from that example. I think
Hmm.
we've learned a lot as an industry from NEM one, NEM two, NEM three, and now I think we need to make sure we're not falling into the same trap or following similar mistakes when we talk about EV tariffs and especially vehicle to grid tariffs, right? We want to make sure that
Right.
we're learning from previous mistakes and rolling out economically efficient tariffs moving forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, we should learn from our past mistakes. I mean, if you think about, of course, we're both here in California, and of course, there was the whole deregulation and the bankruptcies because of the way certain markets were structured, and I think folks did learn from those experiences. And you're
Mm-hmm.
right. I remember when there was so little solar that the utilities didn't even it wasn't even
Mm-hmm.
counted in their resource plans.
Right.
They were sort of assuming, oh, there's some little of it. And obviously now we're kind of at the opposite issue. And not everybody has solar, but, we also have rules like net zero all new homes net zero. And so
Mm-hmm.
there is going to just be more DERs. That's just
Mm-hmm.
the fact. We are still going to have centralized generation, although that's going to be cleaner and greener, and it's going to be more like offshore wind, which I remember years ago said, "Oh, you can't do it in California; it's
Mm-hmm.
too steep of a drop off." Now we're talking about doing it because the technology has advanced in terms of the floating platforms and everything. Well, we've been talking for a while, so I think we're going to have to wrap up. So, any final words of wisdom, encouragement, anything you want to say?
Yeah, no. Thanks, Peter. Well, I really enjoyed speaking with you, and as we've been discussing, I think VPPs are really exciting. Kind of, it's a rapidly evolving space, and I'm excited to see how we could collaborate with our peers in the space and with our regulators across different regions to help kind of push this business model forward. We're excited to see more VPPs rolled out in the next decade or so.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Sruthi. Okay.
Yeah,
Bye
thanks for
bye.
your time.